Welcome everyone to Strait Science. Strait Science is an evening seminar series put on by University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus in Nome and University of Alaska Fairbanks Alaska Sea Grant. And tonight you're in the home office. And we have for tonight's, oh wait, I should say that both Northwest Campus and Alaska Sea Grant, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region. We serve all peoples of the region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, and Central Yupik peoples. So we're really diving in on Strait Science, on the Bering Strait region tonight. And we have Rick Thoman, no stranger to the region or Strait Science, and the man we all turn to when we have panic, actually, about the weather. So not only we know Rick's on the case in the good weather and the bad weather, and always there, also a public servant for the Bering Strait region at a much higher level and comprehensive level than anyone else I know, honestly. So Rick Thoman is the climate specialist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Preparedness, lovingly known as ACAP. And it says IARC on his name tag, but he really is with ACAP if you look at his vest, if you get to see a little bit down there. There it is. So on this calm, cold night, it's minus 28 here at the house tonight and cold pretty much throughout the region, I believe. What a better way to start off the wacky 2026 year than to start off with kind of I think Rick was saying, well, it would be, and I agree, it would be nice to have a calm, straight science with no crises yet, no X-typhoons coming or record water or landslide, whatever. Just a nice evening, a cold evening outside, and we're going to hear about Western Alaska's weather and climate through the years. So save your questions to the end and let Rick take it away. I'm really looking forward and so glad you're here, Rick. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, Gay, for the introduction. And thanks, everyone, for joining in. So, yeah, as Gay said, we thought this would be a nice way to kind of start the year, the Strait Science year, on a note. This is actually a presentation that I've wanted to give for a long time. In fact, we had it queued up in October when I was in Nome, and coming on the heels of the storm before Halong and then Halong, we decided to put it off. But Western Alaska's weather and climate through the years combines a bunch of things that really interest me. So I like history, I like weather and climate, of course, and I like the Bering Strait region. So, what's not to like? So the idea here is to kind of go through the history of weather and climate with a focus on observations through time here. And I think this is worthwhile because, it helps to put where we're at now into perspective. See if we can make the technology work. Okay, here is our plan for tonight. I'm going to start off from before actually Western weather and climate observations with traditional stories and what Western science can contribute to that. Then we'll go through kind of maybe what you expected, the weather and climate observations from the Western science way. And I've just broken this up into several different eras here. We'll dive into some details on Nome weather and climate observations and then end up with just a few slides on the future of weather and climate information. All right, so of course, all across Western Alaska, from Northwest Arctic Borough down to the YK Delta, there are traditional stories of years without a summer that caused severe hardship for folks. So these would have been summers that were so severe that it caused memorable hardship, starvation, or inability to get to resources, and those were passed down. So it turns out that Western science can potentially put some timing on when some of these events might have occurred. So back in 2004, Roseanne Dorigo and co-authors published a paper, and what they did is they looked at spruce tree cores from the central and eastern Seward Peninsula, so basically from like east of Council over towards Koyuk. They sampled about 4 dozen trees. So they're looking at things like tree ring width, which is maybe you might think of, but also something called the maximum wood density, which is also related to the warmth in the growing season. So going through all these trees, they were able to construct a timeline and correlate that with temperatures based on the Nome observations after 1900. And so what they found is going back to about 1650, which is about the oldest that they had any confidence in their reconstructions, they found a number of very cold years, very cold relative to the 20th century climate. Now, what's really interesting, and if there's history buffs on, this is something we could probably learn more about. The number one coldest summer from these tree records they reconstructed was in 1896. So obviously we have some documentation of what was going on in the Bering Strait region in 1896. It would be very interesting to know, for instance, was that a particularly poor whaling year? But that reconstructed as the coldest summer since say 1650 for the Seward Peninsula, with the average temperature for the summer a solid 9 degrees colder than the modern average. And summer here being defined as May to August. Now, there's no obvious things like volcano eruptions that can be attributed to 1896. That's recent enough that there probably weren't any big volcanic eruptions involved in that. However, that's not the case with the second coldest summer, which was 1873, just fractionally not as cold as 1896. And that followed the eruption of the Loki volcano in Iceland, well documented in Iceland. And that was a very cold summer for the Seward Peninsula, also for a lot of the northern hemisphere, potentially, at least relative to normal, even colder in the interior than on the Seward Peninsula. So that one looks pretty closely tied to that big volcanic eruption. I put down a couple of cold years there. 1859 was also a very cold summer, and the coldest of the earliest records there, 1675. Now, one interesting thing here, so you may have heard about the year without a summer. Krakatoa volcano in the Southwest Pacific erupted in December of 1815, and the following summer across eastern North America and in Europe, there were late snows, early frost, lots of crop failures, and it became known as the year without a summer. However, based on this tree information that Roseanne D'Amago and his co-authors reconstructed, 1816 on the Seward Peninsula does not look unusual. Maybe a little bit cooler than normal, but certainly nothing like some of these other cold years. So again, pointing out that regionality of some of these impacts, even with things like a massive volcanic eruption like Krakatoa. All right, so now let's move into the earliest written observations. Obviously, people have been observing the weather as we learn through traditional stories, but just from our own experience for thousands and thousands of years in the region. But let's go to what the documentation that we have. So the earliest records that we have from the Bering Strait region do not come from Russian American observations. The Russians did make some weather observations when they owned Alaska, some from what's now known as Kodiak, and more systematically from Sitka. Of course, there were Russian outposts as far north as St. Michael. If they made any weather observations, they haven't survived. Excuse me. The earliest observations that we would call weather or climate observations done in a systematic way in the region were started by the U.S. Army beginning in 1877. This was part of the Army established a number of short-lived forts in Alaska, St. Michael, most of them in southeast, but also St. Michael, and then Fort Gibbon on the Yukon River, near where Tanana is now. This was followed in the following years with a handful of observations made by commercial interests or observers. And luckily for us, in 1906, this guy named Cleveland Abe, who was the first chief meteorologist of the Weather Bureau, gathered together all of the information that he could find on Alaska for this publication. And Cleveland Abe was a really sharp cookie. He was quite aware that sometimes the tail grows taller down the line, and took a very scientific and comprehensive approach to analyzing the weather data. And luckily for us, he pulled all this information together, and at least some of the information that he has in this publication, we can't find anymore. So he had access to stuff that either has been lost or is buried very deep in some archive. So here's a list of some of the early observations for the region. Some of these were very short-lived. The O'Malley observations there northwest of Elam apparently was from a mine. There's only about 8 months of daily climate observations. Some lasted longer, but none of these became continuous at this point. Now, I do want to share with you, I know this is impossible to read, but this is a page. This was actually one big book. This is 2 facing pages of the observation that the Army was making at St. Michael's in December of 1884. And I know you can't read it, but what I want you to get out of this is these are really detailed observations. They're doing things like barometric pressure, temperatures, winds, and clouds 3 times a day in excruciating detail here. This was not a haphazard effort. Didn't turn out to be long-lived, but the folks involved in this knew what they were doing, and they did quite a thorough job in documenting what was happening. And they did this for a number of years at St. Michael. So there is a period there in the late 1870s and 1880s when we actually have good idea of weather and at least seasonal climate for there. Here's a more typical example. This is the form from Gamble from 1903. This is for June of 1903. The temperatures are on the left-hand side there. You can see that temperatures, highs in the 30s, lows in the 20s early in the month and 30s later in the month. So, okay, that does not look terribly unusual for June. At Gamble, notice the last couple of the days of the month are missing. One of the great uses of this old data are when people happen to put in remarks. And here I've highlighted in red there a couple of remarks that the observer here, which apparently was Edgar Campbell, a doctor, that on the 11th there, or is that the 10th, he made a remark of more open water. So presumably that means there had been some open water, but it expanded enough to note on or about the 10th. However, then later in the month, on the 24th, he writes, ice in again. So the ice has come back late in June into Gamble. Certainly in the early 20th century, ice into Gamble at the end of June would not be particularly unusual. All right, so now we're going to just go through the eras here. So I've basically from, kind of the initial push of the gold rush up through World War I here. At this point, the Weather Bureau, anything like administration center, was in Seattle for Alaska. And so Alaska was pretty far from Seattle. And you can see here, this is pretty much all of the places that had any kind of weather or climate information in this period here, up through World War I. Nome and Candle, I've marked, I've identified, putting the names on there. And those are the only two places here that have more than about 2 years of observations in this period. Council's got a couple years. Deering has about 18 months. Gamble has a few years, but Nome and Candle, which of course were the two supply centers for mining, were the primary places here where we have more than just a scattering of observations. So that changes quite a. Oh, I was going to show you one here. This one here, so that dot in the middle of the Seward Peninsula, that is Doll Creek, basically where the Quartz Creek observation is these days. A great place for an observation. One of the very few mining concerns that ever did climate observations. And luckily, they were doing observations during March 1911, which is still the greatest March cold wave of record, not just for the Seward Peninsula, but for much of northern Alaska. And you can see there on March 12th, 60 below, and high temperatures there, 35 below as late as the 21st. Really an impressive late season cold snap there. You can see they've got some precipitation recorded. Notice too that there's no snow information, and that of course is been a problem for a long time and continues today. Okay, now we go to the post-World War I era. So this is kind of the interwar era. And you can see there's a whole lot more red dots on the map here. So in 1917, the Weather Bureau opened the Juneau office, which was staffed by Weather Bureau employees, and they took over the administration of Alaska weather and climate observations from Seattle. And the result was, in Western Alaska and indeed around the state, we have many more observations. We of course have the expansion of aviation during this time, but we also have more community observations. And in some of these places, the observations are not being done by missionaries or commercial interests, but by local people. There's some of the others too, but that's part of the expansion here, is more local people were getting involved in this. Again, the places identified by name there are the places that have multiple years of observations. Again, some of these are very short-lived. There's only about 8 months of observations there from King Island, and down what became a Luckenock there, it's only got about 10 months of observations. But of course, Nome has observations. The orphanage at Pilgrim did observations for quite a number of years. Shishmaref has pretty good observations during this time, as did White Mountain. All right, now, of course, now we go to World War II and beyond. So this, of course, there was a massive expansion of weather observations with the war, and it really took off. There was some retraction of the weather observations after the war ended, but for the most part, they continued. The sites in blue there, I put those on there. These were a couple of very short-lived climate observations that were done by the military, but I put them on there because they're in places that we don't have much else. Some of these you can see there, Uncounted, first observations associated with Lend-Lease. Some of these are the military bases established after the war, like Northeast Cape on St. Lawrence Island, Tin City, just to the east of Wales. But pretty big expansion here. Some community observations, but overall, community members doing observations during this time. Maybe retracted a little bit after the war, but then expanded during the 1970s and 80s as aviation came to all communities, and there were quite a number of what were called contract observations, where people in the community had contracts with either the FAA or the Weather Service to provide observations, typically 6 or 8 a day, to serve aviation, and they did climate observations. And at the tail end of our period here, so basically starting in the late 1980s, we saw the first deployment of automated observations. In Western Alaska, that was primarily to support wildfire. 1977 was a huge wildfire year on the Seward Peninsula, and as the technology became available to automate, to have automated stations that didn't require commercial power and could transmit that information via satellite, that's how we wound up with the Quartz Creek and Haycock RAWS sites. I even took cough drops so I wouldn't cough, but that obviously failed. Sorry. Okay, 1995. The first automation of aviation observations started in the early 90s, but really started to take off in the mid-90s. So that's why I put 95 as our break. And here we have, during this time, automation is everywhere. People are basically, to a very large extent, removed from the process of observations. Prior to the mid-90s, the Weather Service was the primary federal agency responsible for weather and climate observations. The FAA has had a role even back to when it was the CAA days. And so you had places like Uncounted and Moses Point. But during the most recent decades, the FAA has become the primary federal agency providing aviation weather observations. And as we know, been a great expansion into most communities into the region now have an FAA weather station at their airstrip, a couple owned and operated by the Weather Service. But the Weather Service's role in gathering weather and climate observations in the region is greatly decreased in the most recent era. And an important development from my perspective, being a climate person, in this time, we really see a split between weather observations and climate observations. Prior to the mid-90s, if a place did aviation weather observations, even if they weren't full-time, they still did a climate observation. So they recorded things like highs and lows, precipitation, hopefully snow. But that went out the window in the automation era, and we have very distinct weather observations and that don't do what we would consider basic climate stuff. The number of climate observations, as we'll see, has decreased quite dramatically. So here is my updated list. You might have seen this graphic before. So this is basically every agency gauge that's currently deployed in the region. These are never all working at the same time, although in the summer, most of them will be reporting. And you can see this is really the golden age of weather observations. We could only dream of this kind of density of information back in the 80s and early 90s before automation came to the fore. So you can see here we've got pretty good coverage across the interior Seward Peninsula, almost every coastal community, with the exceptions of Stebbins and Diomede. There's still some holes that we would like to fill. Certainly west, kind of northwest of Nome, south of Teller, there's a substantial gap. You might remember a 3 years ago, I did a little poll on our Facebook group, and I just asked people, where would you like to see a weather observation? We'll give you the magic wand, and you can put one anywhere you want. And the winner of that was the Woolly Lagoon area. And as you can see, that's an area with a gap here on our little map. The area kind of to the east of Wales and south of Shishmaref there, the western inland portion of the Seward Peninsula, another gap, as well as kind of the area there kind of to the east of Amuric Lake. There's a gap. But again, these gaps are we can be nitpicky now because we have so many. Really quite a dramatic change from what we had even 30 years ago. However, if we want climate data, and I'm just going to define climate data very simply, we get year-round temperatures and precipitation, and that has dwindled to hardly anything. We've got temperature and precipitation from the Weather Service automated sites in Nome and Kotzebue when they're working. The problem with climate data is any missing data is bad, and that hurts. Two of the Natural Resources Conservation Service SNOTELs also do a pretty good job with temperatures and precipitation. The one at Pilgrim Hot Springs, of course, is just been it's only been in there 18 months. The one at Pargon Creek, east of Council there, has been in there longer. And of course, the good folks at KNOM making a valiant effort when they can to try to supplement the Nome data that we lost with the loss of the snow information about 7 years ago. All right, so that's kind of our rundown of through the decades here. Now let's go into some details on the Nome observation history. So the early years, the very first written climate observations made in the summer of 1900. Then there's a gap of daily climate observations till the summer of 1906, and that July 1906 marks the start of Nome's continuous climate observation history. There was only precipitation July through November, presumably above 1906. Presumably at some point a thermometer showed up in the mail, or two thermometers, and the associated structures needed to mount that. So we have temperatures starting in December of 1906. Unfortunately, they didn't have any spares because their maximum temperature thermometer was broken on October 10th, 1915, and it took until late January of the following winter there to get a replacement. Now, during the earliest years here through 1916, observations were made once a day. Although even in the earliest days, those observations were sometimes transmitted out on the telegraph. Now, as I mentioned, 1917, late 16, the Weather Bureau office in Juneau was established, and that coincided with this big push to get more weather observations around Alaska. And so Nome in 1916 became what was called a second order Weather Bureau station. We would probably think of that these days as something like a contract observer. People in the community received some equipment and at least a small amount of money to do observations. For most of the 1916 to 1930 period, there were 2 observations done that included things like winds, barometric pressure, temperatures, and some estimate of clouds. And those were sent out on the telegraph twice a day. Now, there are, as you might guess during this time, some data quality issues. Some of them are trivial, some of them are more substantial. The biggest thing is, again, snow information is spotty, and there's definitely some shall we say, some unbelievable things recorded in the sense that it doesn't seem consistent with things like the precipitation recorded. So that takes us to the summer of 1930. On August 1st, 1930, the Weather Bureau established a first order station in Nome. That meant that trained Weather Bureau employees came from somewhere else. I believe the first person assigned to Nome had previously been assigned in Juneau. And so you had Weather Bureau employees taking observations. Initially, they stuck to the 2-a-day schedule, but that increased in the 1930s to 4 a day. And then in March 1941, Nome, as in other places around Alaska, hourly observations around the clock were begun, and that at least nominally has continued to this day. In the spring of 1946, upper air observations were started, and the Weather Bureau office moved from where it had been downtown out to Marks Field. Of course, the airport that the military built for the war effort. Now, one change that some of you will remember was in 1983, Alaska changed time zones, and Nome moved up 2 hours from Bering time to Alaska time. Now, that doesn't maybe sound like a lot, but it actually has an impact on the climate data record in the summertime. Of course, nowadays, it's not uncommon because of this shift in the time zone for Nome to have its highest temperatures very late in the evening. And some of that bleeds over into the daily climate data. The really big change, of course, occurs on July 1st, 1998. The automated observation is commissioned, and that ends the fully human observations that had been made for the previous 93 years. And initially, the Weather Service staff at Nome continued to automate to augment the observation. So would not only modify the weather observation as needed, but also the climate data as well. So there were many times, especially with winter storms, where the automated observation precipitation was clearly too low, and the staff at the Weather Service office would put in amounts from the manual gauges that were still in place. However, in 2019, In November, all of that climate data augmentation ceased, and that was the end of the snow observation of all snow observations from the airport, as the automated system does not report anything quantitative about snow. Of course, it does report if snow is falling, but nothing about the snow amounts or snow depths. So that was a big loss, ending more than a century of snow observations, albeit sometimes suspect. But now we have nothing now for 6 years, over 7 years. Here's where the observations that we call the Nome climate record have been. The early years there were somewhere downtown. I made that circle actually bigger on purpose because it moved around a bunch of times. It appears to have been mostly towards the east side of Nome, where the offices were actually physically located. We also know that in the great 1913 coastal flood, that the observations were not interrupted. So we know that it was back, the observation site was back away from Front Street in that event. And in the 1934 fire, which burned a lot of the business section of downtown Nome, the Weather Bureau office was not directly, the office was not burned in that fire. So a bigger circle there. You can see most of the early years through 1946, somewhere downtown, the exception being for 2 years, the observations were made out at Fort Davis. The radio post there at Fort Davis burned down on Christmas Day, 1929, and presumably the weather observations were moved back into town at that point, and then when still there when the Weather Bureau First Order Station opened up in the summer of 1930. So move out to Marks Field, 1946. Observations through 1998. Most of the observations were on the south side of the runway. Again, moved around a little bit. However, temperatures from 1966 to 98 were made near what's now the intersection of the two runways. So a little bit farther inland. Precipitation, though, was continued to be made on the south side of the main runway there. And since 1998, the automated observation system is up off of the on the west side of the north-south runway there. So why does any of this matter? Well, as we all know, temperatures, especially in the summer, but not only in the summer, can vary greatly depending just how far you are from the Bering Sea. And that's pretty clear in the climate record that when the observations were in town, so the early years, that summer temperatures are decidedly not as warm as the move out to Marks Field. So here is the very first written daily record of Nome observations. People, of course, have been observing weather in the Nome area for thousands of years, but here's the first daily record in August of 1900. And it was made by the North American Trading and Transportation Company, which was a big player, not only in the Nome Gold Rush, but in most of the gold rushes around Alaska and beyond. For a number of years, they were an important player in the steamboat industry running up and down the big rivers of Alaska. So this was the very first, but it didn't stick. There was observations in September of that year, which was also a stormy time, and then we didn't get anything until reestablished until the summer of 1906. I thought I'd put this one up. I mentioned that the Weather Bureau didn't burn up in the 1934 fire, but this is the kind of detail that was available. This is actually the day of the big fire, and you can See there on the bottom left-hand side, or I'm sorry, bottom right-hand side there, says Nome fire began at 10:28 a.m., destroyed entire business section and several homes. Estimated losses $2 million. So that's quite a piece of valuable information there, contemporary record. And also of interest here, look at the observations there. If you can see my cursor there, we have the wind direction and the wind speed. No surprise, right? A common theme in early Alaska town fires. We had quite a windy day, northeast winds, so a dry, low humidity, and sustained strong winds. Notice also some really interesting stuff, again, kind of reminiscent of that 1884 St. Michael. We got a lot of details. So we got hourly wind data. We've got hours of sunshine right above the wind information there, and the thermograph trace there is reproduced at the bottom left-hand side there. So a lot of information here. The Weather Bureau in the 1930s here taken the job of observing and recording the weather very seriously. And this is what it looks like today, literally today. This is on the left-hand side, this is the hourly observations, aviation observations with lots of aviation-related data and some climate information there as well. And then the climate summary there from for yesterday from the Weather Service, putting it all together. Those are the kinds of information that we are getting out of Nome today. Now, I do want to give a shout out here for the Nome area that thanks to personal weather stations and the internet, we now can really document well the great variation in weather and climate in the immediate Nome area. This was an interest of mine in the 1980s when I put out, one summer I put out thermographs at the old Dexter Roadhouse restaurant, and then one at Dexter and one in Banner Creek, and had these little thermographs that I had to go out and change the paper every week, and to document those summertime differences in temperature. Well, now we've got personal weather stations up and down the Cougar Rock Road as well as around town. This was a really informative graphic, I thought, from the July 4th, 2024 rain. And you can see the variability in the rain amounts here. So the airport officially at 2.66 inches, but a lot of places there in excess of 3 inches, but less rain there, Banner Creek and north. So that kind of detail is really helps to get a handle on just how complex the Norton Sound, the mountains, the river valleys, how all of these come together to create really the different climates over very short distances that are part of the Seward Peninsula landscape. Now we're up to the future. All right, so Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island already have very good theoretical coverage of weather stations at communities. When they're working, we have observations from aviation observations from all the airports except for Stebbins and Diomede. And the legislation that was passed last year that the FAA has touted proposes to install an automated observation at Stebbins and an aviation webcam at Diomede, which would bring us some information now from every community. However, this legislation really doesn't address the ongoing problem that we in Western Alaska and indeed in all of rural Alaska have had with the Weather Service and FAA automated stations, and that's the communications problems. on any given day, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the FAA and Weather Service stations are not reporting online. And as you might guess, nearly all of those outages are in rural Alaska. In the past week or 10 days, there's been almost as many observations in the lower YK region have been out as have been working. We in the current federal situation, we certainly are at the Park Service and NRCS weather station sites are certainly at risk of being removed or not maintained, and this means that in the future, like in so many things, those local observations are going to become even more important because the federal government is very unlikely to be there to supply that as they have over the last 100+ years. And for my world, in the climate world, I post graphics like this regularly. We really are having more and more to rely on these climate analysis models. They're great regionally. It paints a picture that we just don't have in observations in place to get to. This is an example from December 21st. Really an extreme example there with temperatures up near freezing on St. Lawrence Island and southernmost Chukotka there to average daily temperatures there in the Yukon Valley east of Unalakleet there, colder than 25 below zero. So really, this is the kind of thing we can get out of these regional models, and it's really useful, but this is not the same as point observations. The actual values from the climate models generally are not going to correspond with what an instrument would read. Some of that is resolution. This particular graphic, the resolution of the grid that goes into this is 100 square kilometers, so 40 square miles, and a temperature observation from Nome Airport is literally at that one exact spot. So some of it is we wouldn't expect them to exactly agree, but they're really two different animals. But nonetheless, because of the decline in year-round temperature precipitation observations, much less snow, this is what we're going to have to rely on now and into the future. So that is what I have for you tonight, Koyanak. And thanks a lot to Gay for inviting me, and of course for help in making these slides as good as they could be. So thanks, and be happy to take any questions if there are any.
All right. Thank you so much, Rick. That was so awesome. Before while you're thinking of your questions, this is the time at Strait Science where it's nice to honor the speaker. And so this is a good time to write some, oh, look at that. People are good on their electronics now, but you can also put in the chat. It's never easy to be a public speaker. And Rick has taken time out of a long day already to bring this so interesting presentation to us. So thank you so much, Rick. And with that, while everyone's doing that, oh yeah, look at that. Well done. Yeah, people have gotten really good on their graphics. Zipping by the screen. With that, any questions to start us off? I know I've got some, but well, while everyone's writing their thing, Rick, we'll leave it up to Doug. So Doug, go ahead. Your hand is up. Floor is yours.
Yeah, Rick, great presentation, really informative there. I'm just wondering what the funding status is for ACAP there. Any changes that you know of in the near future?
Well, that is a very good question. And I think the answer is We don't know. We are in the last year of our current 5-year grant. So unless something untoward happens, you have to put up with me at least through August. We are cautiously optimistic that a new call for funding is going to come out sometime in the next couple of months. But we're cautiously optimistic that will happen, but nobody seems to have any idea of what they will be asking for in this round. So there's hope for sure, I think is the most optimistic thing we can say.
Yeah, okay, but to see anything with climate in its name seems like it's at risk there, but I wish the best for you. Thanks.
Yeah, so we'll have to see. So Gay, I see your comment there about ICPEC being a good place for an boy, wouldn't that be nice? That would be fantastic.
And lots of travelers too.
Yeah.
Any other questions? While you were talking for a while there, Rick, when you were saying that 1896 was the coldest regional summer, exceptionally cold for the Seward Peninsula. And I was thinking, okay, first you were asking what were some of the things. First, I thought, when was the famine on St. Lawrence Island? But that's not it. I looked that up. That's 1878, 1880 in there. So that wasn't it. But I ran downstairs, and if you guys will let me read 2 paragraphs, I dug into my Whales, Ice, and Men, which is a book by John R. Bockstoce, Bockstoce. I highly recommend it if you're interested in the history of the region and some of the commercial marine mammal harvest that was going on here. But there is a note about 1896. So,
and it says,
so 1895, it turns out, I'll just read the brief sentence for 1895. Oh, mind you, and I just wanted to mention 1859 was when the first commercial oil well goes into play in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And it took decades for that to ramp up, but that was putting pressure by the 1890s. It's getting to be tough for if your focus is on commercial whaling for whale oil lamps, the industry is starting to have a shift at about this time. So anyway, 1895, it's quick. The season was cold, icy, and a dismal failure. And there was some ships that were shunted in quick and actually trapped. But the failure of 1895 was only the beginning of the misfortunes. The summer of 1896 was exceptionally icy. The ships on their way north, so this would be June, right? June 1896, I would imagine, because it's the summer. The ships were on their way north from San Francisco, first discovered this state of affairs when they found heavy ice south of St. Matthew Island. At the beginning of July, they found Port Clarence completely frozen over with shore-fast ice protruding 8 miles at sea.
Wow.
That's a lot. That's a lot of ice there for that. They had to resupply from tenders at sea using what little protection they could find under the lee of King Island. In the eastern Beaufort Sea, the ice was so heavy that the inside fleet was unable to get past the Mackenzie Delta. That would be the Mackenzie River Delta up east of Coctovic until the very end of July. So there you go. The following year, it sounds like they had some ships also crushed in the ice, but it doesn't tell you about the ice conditions and include something like Port Clarence. So that's there you go. If anyone's interested, I can put the name of that book in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Gay. That is really interesting and certainly goes along very nicely with the tree based reconstructions of summer temperatures.
Yeah, I mean, if you have Shore fast ice the first week of July nowadays, protruding 8 miles unbroken. That's impressive.
That would be something.
Yeah, newsworthy, I'm sure. So I also was going to ask, how can we help you, or how can we help ourselves to get weather stations that are operational or maintained at a better rate? Like you were saying, how, what was that? Half of the YK stations aren't working potentially.
Yeah, in the last week, it's been really dismal in the lower YK region with
Is there a way? I see it, Charlie. Is there a way we can help you, or an effort to be more vocal to the right entities? Is there a way we can, as citizens?
Well, of course, we've been pounding this drum for a long time. Every week, we are the Nugget is publishing kind of the weather station status in the
Yeah,
region, and we know that this the FAA is aware of this and has in the past been less than happy about that. Um, to my mind, I think I think that it's important that we just keep hammering on this idea, you know, that we need the stations that are in place to actually work. Installing more stations that don't transmit data is not helpful. What would be most helpful is get the assets that the US taxpayers have already paid for, get that information reliably out to the public for aviation safety, for search and rescue, for community safety, for travel planning. So I think really keep hitting on the importance of these observations, and that resources need to be dedicated to make what we have work. I think that's far more important than installing a whole bunch of new sites.
that's wonderful. So you would say, like, we should write the FAA or be in touch with FAA, or National Weather Service, or politicians beyond. Would
Well,
it help?
certainly, the Alaska congressional delegation was heavily involved in that
Okay.
in the that legislation to provide more weather stations. And I think hearing from constituents that's, hey, that's great, but we got a whole bunch of weather stations out here that we can't rely on. Maybe they're working today,
Yeah,
maybe we're working yesterday, but the history is we don't know if they're going to be working tomorrow. Then
right.
we
And
need that reliability.
it's so important for our safety as regional citizens, plus the other commerce and things like that. So thank you very much, Rick. Charlie, then Doug.
Well, thanks. Yeah, Rick, I always enjoy your talks, and it's good. I just had a comment. I Yesterday about 5:30 p.m. I shortly after dark, I had to kill some time, so I took a drive down towards Cape Nome and back. Got almost to Hastings before I turned around. But anyway, the car thermometer in Nome was -11. The car thermometer at the bridge at Fort Davis was -24, and it stayed, about -20 as I went over the high ground down towards Hastings. But definitely cool right down on the river bottom. And then when I got back to Nome, it was 10 degrees, -10. So it's a microclimate in Nome, I suppose, and cold air flowing down the river bottom. I just thought that was interesting. So.
Yeah, it is, and it's one of the things I love about the personal weather stations. Having that, we can see that in real time, and it's interesting. The couple of years that the Nome weather observations were at Fort Davis there in 1928, 29. There's a clear increase in the range in the high to low temperatures, which is not surprising given they were sampling, on some days that colder Nome River air.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Charlie.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Doug, here, floor is yours.
Yeah, Rick, for the stations that are down in Western Alaska, the 50% or so, do you have any information on specifically what the problems are? Is it just the cold or?
No, it's definitely not related to the cold. It's typically the issue is actually not the hardware of the weather station. The weather station is working fine. The problem is the communications, the getting the observation from the weather station out to the world. There's a bunch of places where that can fail, from the local phone company on up through the FAA center. That's by far the most typical. There may be hardware issues at some of the places. For instance, a Monic has been offline for a couple of months now. That may not be a telecommunications issue. It's generally hard to know exactly what the problem is. And these out, sometimes we have the problem where the observations come and go. So we might get observations for 6 hours, and then it goes away for 4 hours, and then it comes back for an hour. Those are some kind of telecommunications issues. These are not new. We did a study here at ACAP on weather station availability, and amazingly, the maximum amount of observations available, the observations availability peaked about 2015 and has been going down since then. So this is not a new problem, but it's gotten a lot worse in the last decade. I think particularly since COVID, it's gotten really, really bad. And there's been lots of talk about how to fix that communications problems, and based on nothing but looking at what's available, those have not been implemented.
So for the places where telecommunications is the failure, is the data actually still being recorded but not getting transported to a weather service?
Right. So sometimes it's the data just isn't getting all the way to the internet, but you could pick up the phone and call it, and you could hear the automated voice say, Shishmaref 1343 Zulu, winds north 18 knots, gusting 34 knots. Like you could do that, or and then even more frequently, that observation would be available on frequency to pilots. The problem, so that's all good. The problem with all that is what you get is the weather at that instant. There is no way to know, okay, is the wind increasing or decreasing? Is the ceiling coming up or down or not changing? There's no way to know that, because all you get is the instantaneous observation. And if it isn't transmitted to the internet, that data is lost to the world forever. The FAA does not allow access to that data after the fact, so it could be archived for weather or climate purposes.
Yeah, I'm thinking for climate purposes, so it's not even archived. Yeah, okay. Thanks.
It is archived if it makes it to the internet, but there's no pull of the data after the fact.
So half the stations aren't helping with the climate monitoring. Okay, thanks.
In the lower YK at the moment.
And maybe someone has a new copy of the Nome Nugget, can tell us how many are out in the Bering Strait region this week. So it was interesting to me, Rick, to hear that I wrote it down, 1916 and 1930, that the government was actually had this contract, or contractors and people were being paid to get the weather. And it seems like we were more advanced back then than where we are right now with nothing.
Yeah, and those contract observations, they continued in some form, until the era of automation. So, when I was a young buck forecaster in Nome in the late 80s, there were contract observers at Shishbrough, at Gamble, at Savunga. I'm missing at least one. There was the Weather Service, of course, was at Uncounted and Nome. So those contract observations in some form continued right up to automation, and to no one's surprise, right? The very first priority in the automation was to put them in places that people were playing or being paid to take observations. They got the first automated observations.
All right, I'm going to stop your sharing so we can see you bigger. There we go. There you are. All right. Any other thoughts or questions for Rick? I put the name of the book and the author for the that regarding Port Clarence and 1896 in there. Anyone else?
Anybody have anything else?
Quiet.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to give this presentation. All of this stuff, of course, near and dear to my heart, and it's so important. I think, especially in the context we have set this kind of documentation in the Bering Strait region, so it helps us to know how things were and help inform where we're going, I think.
Oh, I think it was brilliant. I learned tons. And plus, it's nice to see that context in the history of Nome and the history of the region. I don't know, with the return of the military, will we get more weather stations? I don't know. Oh, there's a question in the chat from Jim Dory. How about the current storm warning? Not hitting Nome? Dodging a bullet?
So my take is that this is going to be kind of a classic setup where the winds are going to scream in the usual north wind blowholes. So across the Topcock Hills, kind of between Nome and Teller there, over the high country where the cold air squirts out on the west side of the mountains. But Nome is going to be, the wind will be mostly blocked by the terrain, and so winds at Nome will not be particularly strong. I would not recommend taking your snow machine from Nome to White Mountain here in the next couple of days.
Yeah, that's good reminder. Thank you. Even though it's calm here, if you don't know the weather where you're going, you could run into the perfect setup of what we're talking about. If you don't know or can't get the weather where between here and there, you might find yourself don't trust what you see. So that's there is the forecast out there, but that's a good example. And oh, that's another question. Someone's asking what are we having for dinner? We're having chicken. With that, any other questions or thoughts to Rick? We sure hope we see you back here, Rick. And I'm just grateful it was for such an interesting and informative talk about Nome and Nome's history. I love the bit about the fire, too. Did anyone know that the Weather Service had that information from the fire for the fire day?
Yeah, and we have that kind of high level detail. That was the way things were done in the pre-World War II era. For the first order Weather Bureau stations, that was the era where the Weather Bureau, observations were number one, and forecasting was also part of the job, but was not done at the exclusion of accurate, detailed observations.
Right. I'm a bit of a Luddite, so I like to see that additional human note, a machine wouldn't have gotten you that the town was destroyed and the time the fire started and all that sort of stuff. So, and the cost, estimated cost. So
And
yeah,
we've gone through those forms, extracted things like first ice in the fall, breakup in the spring. They didn't record that every year, but they did some, and it's information that otherwise would have been lost.
I agree. And there's a question in the chat. What is the current temperature at Dexter? -24 Fahrenheit. So I don't know what it's going on in town, but maybe we're starting to equal out. What's the temperature in town? Anybody?
In
We'll do our own.
Anchorage, it's -10 all day.
Ah, okay. Well, that's macro climate, I think. But anybody got Nome? Charlie, you got any? Pull it up on Nome Airport.
-13 and at my house.
Okay.
Dave
Icy days.
Cannon.
-26 at the airport.
Oh, -26 at the
7 o'clock.
airport. Okay. Wow. Wow.
Wow. So,
-21
so
at
that's
Banner
a
Creek.
great that's a
-20.
great example, right? We got that cold air pooling there, right at the north end of the north runway there.
Yeah.
What did you say? I heard you, Pete.
-21.
Banner Creek.
Yep.
We're all over the place.
Dave
So
Cannon
I'm
out in
guessing
Antioch. What's
some
the
of this
temperature?
is some of this difference is that local pooling, but maybe starting to pick up a little bit of breeze in the Nome River Valley.
Out here in Antioch, we have 30 below.
Oh, well done, Antioch. Good
All
luck
right.
tonight.
I see in Antioch you had 45 below this morning?
Yep, pretty much that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't know you, Dave Cannon, but you win the you win that one. Oof. Oof.
You do know me, but we won't go there.
Oh,
I
okay.
talked to you for a long time after one of the last presentations. I called in late
Uh-huh.
and I kept you on the line for about 20 minutes longer than you wanted to be.
No, that's okay. I do remember you now that you say that. That's awesome. Well, have a safe night tonight. That's
Thank
cold.
you. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. With that, I guess we've got to let Rick Thoman head off and have a calm, pleasant evening. I hope everyone stays warm. Any other last thoughts?
Excellent talk after the fact there too. Question and answer section. Always very informative. So thanks for all.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. With that, I don't know, Rick, if you want to stay on for 1 sec, but we'll
Sure.
see you all next. Straight Science will be on Wednesday next, and it's going to be a report out on a Coeric project that's been focusing on finding some of the heritage collection pieces that were removed from this region in the past. Where are they in museums? It's primarily in the Midwest, is my understanding. And we're going to hear about what that project has found. So those advertisements or announcements will go out here real soon. So hopefully we'll see you next week. And thank you so much all for coming. Have a good night, everyone. Stay warm, stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.